We're going to continue History of the Churches, Churches in Modern Times. This is a very large section because of the way that it's broken down. I didn't break down the PowerPoints into do separate PowerPoint presentations for these different categories when it comes to churches in modern times. So everything's just under the umbrella of churches in modern times. And we previously, in the last few weeks, been focused on the northern fundamental Baptists, those who came out of basically those who were mostly influential and based in the north. And then we have talked about the Northern Baptist Convention, which then turned to the American Baptist Convention and the American Baptist Churches USA, and very much infected with, well, not just infected, but completely overcome in large part with theological liberalism, modernism, and very, very compromised and worldly. But we're switching now to the Southern Fundamental Baptists, and so this is not just talking about fundamental Baptists in the South. These are those who have a certain doctrine and practice that were influenced by key figures from the South. So with the Northern Fundamental Baptists, it was a lot of key figures who were from the North. With the Southern Fundamental Baptists, these are key figures from the South, but they ended up going throughout the country. They ended up going north. They went west. They went various places in addition to being in the South. And so this isn't just limited to the churches or preachers in the South, but that's where the real influence came from. And so this is the largest segment of fundamental Baptists, would be those who are of the Southern influence. And some of the key ones that have some of the key influences have been John R. Rice and Sword of the Lord, and we're not talking about him today, but he'll be one that we talk about. J. Frank Norris, who we will talk about today, and he was his fellowship ended up becoming, or it really wasn't becoming, but there was kind of a split, what became the Baptist Bible Fellowship, and I think his was called the World Baptist Fellowship, but then there was a break-off at some point in time. So, but BBFI indirectly was influenced from J. Frank Norris and what he started. And Bob Jones University you could include in there as far as Southern Fundamental Baptists, if you could call them Baptist, and the college itself is not Baptist. And then also what's called missionary Baptists. There are some of those landmark Baptists. Now, landmark Baptists have a variety of doctrines, so you can't really lump them all into one, but there's a certain doctrine called landmarkism, old landmarkism, and that is, once again, variety of beliefs within landmark Baptists, but it is, for the most part, the belief that with Christ starting the New Testament church with the calling of his disciples, and that there's a straight line of a family line of churches that have come down through from Jesus and the apostles. And then some go so far as to, there are some really that would be more extreme, where they would say, if you can't trace your church's heritage back to the apostles somehow, then you are then it's not really a legitimate church of Jesus Christ. And then there are others who, and along with that, is that believing that each individual church each individual Baptist church is the bride of Christ. And so there's a term called Baptist briderism, so there's a variety of beliefs out there that in one way, shape, or form have that as either some people believe that, some people don't, if they're part of the landmark beliefs. And so you can't necessarily lump them all together, but Baptist bride is part of that idea for many people. And I think the Bible's pretty clear in Revelation that the New Jerusalem is coming down as a bride adorned for her husband, and that the bride consists of, well, the New Jerusalem prepared as a bride, adorned as a bride, prepared for a husband. You had the foundation where you have the tribes of Israel mentioned there, and then also the apostles mentioned. So you have both Israel, Jew, and Gentile. That I believe is that everybody, all the believers, would constitute part of that, because we'll all be in the New Jerusalem. But part of the reason for the belief in Baptist Bride is that it's to me it's a too much of an extreme from. They're trying to stay away from the universal church doctrine, but in staying away from the universal church doctrine of the Protestants and Catholics, then they go too far the other way, and then make something what it really isn't. But at the same time, the core beliefs, though, of a belief in the local church and not for the universal church are good beliefs to have. They just then take them a few steps further. So those are some of the other ones that would be more influential in the South, and it really depends on who you come across and who you. It's just so many different varieties of Baptists, fundamental Baptists, that you can't just lump everybody all together. And but those are just a few of the key influences in the past. And I don't have the names of the people that were. I think J.R. Graves was one of them for landmarkism, and I think there were definitely some other ones as well. But anyway, those are a few of the key influences in the South. Now, the Northern Baptists were not influential in the South, but Southern Fundamental Baptists spread to the North, and you're more likely to find American Baptist churches, which is what the Northern Baptist Convention used to be, or became known as the American Baptist Convention, American Baptist churches. And I think you're more likely to find those in the North when you come to the Northeast, New England. If there's going to be a Baptist church in town, like a First Baptist Church, it's going most likely to be, not always, but an American Baptist church, as we talked about in Providence, First Baptist Church in America, as what it's called, and then the church there in Newport, Rhode Island, John Clark. So a lot of those key Baptist churches that would be right in the middle of town. As a matter of fact, the church it's the Moldovan church on Federal Street, that used to be American Baptist. I don't know what it was called, if it was First Baptist. But so in the North, if you hear a First Baptist church, there's more often than not it's going to be an American Baptist church. If you go to the South and there's a First Baptist church, chances are it's going to be a Southern Baptist church, or at least was a Southern Baptist church. And so there's the differences there in North and South in that way. But the Southern Fundamental Baptists spread to the North. And so, like, for example, John R. Rice's influence, which he influenced, we'll talk about Jack Hyles as well, and there were some different associations there as far as similarities. And a lot of that influence, John R. Rice influence, spread throughout the United States. So it's a lot different than in talking about the Northern Baptists. Now, you might be happy to know that even though it seemed like, there's this whole maze and this web of groups and associations with the Northern Fundamental Baptists, the Southern Fundamental Baptists, there was that to a certain extent, but we are going to be able to focus more on the key individuals who were influential in some of the associations or fellowships, that there's not quite as much, I don't think quite as much of a maze, although there is, the difference here is there's a lot to say about each one. And so it's a matter of picking and choosing what to say about each one. Even just a section on J. Frank Norris would be a big one. You want to talk about an interesting individual, but a lot to say about him. So we'll get into that with Southern Fundamental Baptists. J. Frank Norris, 1877 to 1952, are the years that he lived. He was one of the most influential men among fundamental Baptists, and he was a fighter who was called. He's been called the Texas Tornado. He's was called many-sided, powerful, eccentric, pulpiteering fundamentalist. He was called one of the most controversial, even cantankerous figures of the 20th century. His father was an abusive drunkard, but his mother was a believer who had a greatly positive influence on him. And she was described in this way: her face was marked with trials of discipline and difficulty, yet she bore a peaceful gaiety, the appearance of youth. She had deep within her the peaceful serenity of faith. Deprived, destitute, and never doubting, she was a woman of endless praying. And one time she sent J. Frank to an illegal tavern to deliver a note in which she begged the proprietor not to serve liquor to her husband. And the owners grabbed the boy and kicked him out the back door. When he got home and told her, she told him to drive her to town in their buggy. She took a heavy whip and went in and whipped both of the keepers and broke up the place. And after he broke his father's liquor jug at age 7, he was, after J. Frank broke his father's liquor jug at age 7, he was almost whipped to death with a horsewhip. He was saved and baptized under the ministry of a Baptist pastor named Catlett Smith. His mother died when she was 47, and she had been worn out from a life with a drunken husband who was drunk at her funeral. And just before she died, she put her hand on his face and she said, "My boy, I can't see you, but I can feel your face. Yes, I have felt that face when you were a baby. I have felt it all through the years, but son, I am going home this morning. They have come for me. Do you hear the music? Oh, I wish you could hear it. Never heard such music in the world. Goodbye, son. Preach the old gospel. It's just like I taught you. Preach it on until you come home to mother." Norris graduated from Baylor University and Southern Baptist Seminary. It's hard to believe Baylor University is actually Southern Baptist affiliated. It's a completely worldly organization, a university, but I'm not sure if they still have even any loose connection with Southern Baptist, but that they do have a Southern Baptist connection in their roots. It was said that he had a near photographic memory. He was a serious student of the Bible and memorized Scripture continually. In 1909, Norris was called to be the pastor of the First Baptist Church of Fort Worth, Texas. There was only one, now this was a Southern Baptist church, and there was only one dissenting vote against Norris, and it was from a person who supported him. And this person said, "This church is in no condition for his type of ministry. If he comes, there will be all the firedest explosion ever witnessed in any church. We are at peace with the world, the flesh, and the devil, and one another. And this fellow carries a broad axe and not a pearl-handed penknife. I just want to warn you." So he's saying, look, I'm voting against him, not because he's not a good guy, not because I don't support him, but because I don't think this church can handle somebody like him. For the first couple of years, Norris was content to draw his big salary, wear the nice suits, and not stir things up. That changed when Norris started preaching against the worldliness of his own church members. The head deacon wanted to fire Norris, but Norris fired him first. Norris got rid of boards, committees, and organizations among ladies and young people. He fired the choir director and the deacons who supported the choir director. Now, the reason for that was that the choir director was a beer-guzzling Dutchman who led the choir on Sunday and played for beer gardens during the week. By the end of 1911, the church had lost 600 members and most of its wealth. However, the church ended up being unified in the Word of God, and every deacon, teacher, and choir member was required to separate from worldly practices. Years later, Norris said, "What is needed today in the churches is wholesale destructive work. Use the broad axe of John the Baptist, not a little pearl-handled penknife, on the worldly, card-playing, dancing, hell-raising choir, the board of deacons, and the teaching force." Now, I'm telling you, this guy, he meant business. He said, how many pastors are going to refer to their board of deacons or the choir as worldly, card-playing, dancing, hell-raising choir and board of deacons and the teaching force? Clean out all worldliness. There can be no revival in a church that is run and dominated by the worldly element. And that's absolutely 100% true. There will be no revival in a church that's run and dominated by the worldly element. Norris was uncompromising in his exposure of sin and error. He preached against gambling, dancing, the liquor trade, communism, corrupt politicians, evolution, and liberal theology. He preached against the Catholic Church for a whole week in San Antonio, which was a Catholic stronghold at that time. His messages were the Romanists versus the Bible on the Lord's Supper, the Romanists versus the Bible on papal infallibility, The Romanists versus the Bible on confessional of the priesthood. The Romanists versus the Bible on saint worship. And the purple scarlet-robed woman of prophecy and history. The host pastor said, "I never dreamed that any man had the courage to stand up before thousands of people in San Antonio dominated by Romanists and speak out as clearly as he did for one whole week. I sat behind him and gripped my chair with my hands and prayed to God to give him the message. Large numbers of Roman Catholics have joined our church and I have baptized them. No other man living could have done for San Antonio what ought to have been done right now but Frank Norris. We have been dominated in the city so long by Romanism that large numbers of our people felt that there was no use to protest." Norris also preached one whole week on hell in San Antonio before giving an invitation. When that invitation came, 107 people joined the church. Now, because of his uncompromising stand and his exposure of sin and error, he made a lot of enemies, particularly when he preached against liquor, corrupt politics, and liberal theology. Several attempts were made on his life. His church in Fort Worth was burned down twice. His parsonage was burned down twice. Norris was slandered by the gambling and liquor crowds and even Baptist denominational leaders. Let me tell you something about the liquor crowd. When I was when I went to college in Florida, in Pensacola, at Pensacola Christian College, I took part in a weekly outreach. If we would just, there were several of the men who would, students who would go out, and we would try to pass out tracts and talk to people as we came along them on the streets in Pensacola. And there was a particular part of town that had a bar, or it was modeled after, the section of town in this particular bar was modeled after something you'd see in New Orleans, and I forget what it was actually called, but it was a drinking establishment. And those people, now I don't know if they had had a bad experience with students in the past, but those people who were, I don't know, security or bouncers at that bar, they did not want us even walking in front of their doors. Not even in front of their doors. I mean, they were very, very hostile, and they didn't want us to have it anywhere. We'd have to go across the street and go around the other way. And I don't know the history. Maybe there was something that had happened with somebody coming before, and they'd had a run-in. But either way, when you start, let's put it this way, the gospel message and the Word of God is, when you present that is in direct opposition to the liquor establishment. And because what happens is people's lives get changed, and they no longer patronize those places when they receive the gospel. They have God in their life, and they now live for God. They're not going to be living for drink. And well, guess what? That means their business is under threat. And the alcohol, and even today, the alcohol establishment, the alcohol industry is a very, very powerful one. And I mean, you talk about the billions and billions, probably hundreds of billions of dollars every year that goes into alcohol. Even in this country, I don't know how many billions it would be, but at least tens of billions, and maybe more than that. But so much money. And he was slandered by them, by both the gambling and the liquor crowds. And many of his most bitter opponents, but let me tell you, this is what happens though in churches. When you have a church that's dominated by the worldly element, it mutes the church's voice against those things, and then you fail to make a difference in people's lives and in the community, because even if within the church there's an uncertain sound, you cannot properly stand against the evils of the day. Many of his most bitter opponents eventually repented, including the mayor of Fort Worth. Bill Davis had supported the liquor trade and conducted a meeting against Norris in 1912 in which he shouted, "If there are 50 red-blooded men in this town, a preacher will be hanging from the lamppost before daylight." That was what the mayor of Fort Worth had said. And by the way, alcohol, the liquor, it's still one of the worst vices of the day. Still one of the most evil things of today. I mean, it was evil back then, and I think more people recognized there were people that were willing to stand up against it. And today it should be viewed the same way, is that the alcohol trade, the alcohol establishment industry, the liquor industry is still one of the greatest evils of the day. Now we've taken a step further, and now we have the cannabis industry. So just continually those things get entrenched, and it seems like Western Massachusetts, it seems like, especially up in this area, all that's opening are cannabis and breweries. It seems like it's just loads of them. And they should still be viewed as the evils of the day, without compromise, without apology, saying, no, these things are evils. And that's the way J. Frank Norris approached it. And by the way, if you read the book, I would encourage you to read the book In His Steps by Charles Sheldon. And that's a major theme in that book as well, is the liquor trade. So this mayor was basically telling people, you need to go kill that preacher. But this mayor, later on, when he had a severe case of appendicitis and was told he was going to die, he called for Frank Norris and asked him to get the women in his church to pray for him, because he knew that they had also prayed for Norris, and he knew that there were praying women there who had made a difference, I believe, in Frank Norris's life, and wanted him to make a difference in his life as well. And he did recover, and Norris eventually Norris was able to lead him to Christ, and they became good friends. And he began preaching against evolution in 1921. And he called evolution, quote, that hell-born, Bible-destroying, deity of Christ denying German rationalism. That's how he described evolution. Same thing with the liquor trade, same thing with the cannabis. We should have the same viewpoint of evolution, is that it's just a complete evil teaching and has great moral consequences on this country. And I'm not saying you go up to somebody who believes it, and it depends on who you're talking to. You're not necessarily going to walk up to them and say it the same way J. Frank Norris did. But at the same time, in what is in our hearts, what is rooted and settled in our hearts and minds, should be one of just without apology, without compromise. Here's what the Bible says, here's what's true, and here's evolution and the evils that it has brought to our country with the breakdown of the morals, along with the increase in teaching of evolution. And he's absolutely right. He's born in hell, Bible destroying, which, yes, deity of Christ denying, absolutely, and German rationalism, rooted in German rationalism. Very, very true. He was determined to build the world's largest Sunday school. He hired Louis Ensminger to lead the effort. It grew from 250 in 1913 to 3,000 in 1920 and to 6,000 in 1931. The curriculum consisted of simple teaching through the Bible. Ensminger's method was to train all the active church members in soul winning and get them involved. He also multiplied Sunday school classes, which meant training more teachers and lowering the standards, unfortunately, for the sake of numbers. And there's a balance there, because there's a fine line where you want people to be involved, but you also want to make sure that those who are involved are properly trained and qualified, where you're not going to just fill in worldly people or people who are going to reduce the quality of what's going on. And so evidently this Ensminger didn't probably have that proper balance. But this was characteristic of the Sunday school movement in the 1970s. That was a huge time for the explosive growth, the focus on Sunday schools and the growth of them. And his methods, Ensminger's methods, were very effective in the 60s and 70s. And that was really a lot of the heyday for those types of churches that really focused on building up the Sunday school. Let's get the huge Sunday school. And as we'll talk about Jack Hyles later in a future week, he was focused on bus ministry, bus routes, and get them in. Now, there once again, there's a fine line, because there are literally many cases of pretty much bribing kids to get on the bus, because, well, let's see who can get the most people on the bus this week. Let's have these contests. And so it's one thing to make things fun for kids and enjoyable, that they would actually enjoy their time there. But when it's numbers when it's for the sake of numbers, then it can turn problematic very quickly if that is the main focus, if it's just numbers at all costs. And so, yes, we should be interested in numbers. Obviously, we want as many people here as we can. But we also recognize that we must not lower the standards for the sake of numbers. But anyway, it was very effective in the 60s and 70s, and his was not the only church that had big Sunday school movements. But J. Frank Norris being very influential, when you've got a church like that that's growing rapidly in the Sunday school, other preachers are going to take notice, other pastors are going to take notice, and they're going to emulate many of the same methods. And that's what happened. Jack Hyles and John R. Rice, and John R. Rice was more of he had the Sword of the Lord ministry and wasn't so much as influential as a pastor, but Jack Hyles as a pastor was one who was very influential, where people followed his methods, and because of what appeared to be a lot of success that he had. First Baptist Church was expelled from his county's Southern Baptist Association in 1922 and from the state convention in 1924. He criticized the schools, the Southern Baptist schools, which Baylor was Southern Baptist, and he was criticizing the evolution and criticizing what was being taught there. He didn't use their Sunday school curriculum because he had his own. They just went right through the Bible. And they refused to cooperate in the $75 million campaign. And with the Southern Baptist Convention, a lot of it's been about money, and he didn't. So they kicked him out. They turned on him. The denomination's preachers turned on him with the intent of ruining him, which I find is rather interesting. That they would kick that church out for those particular reasons. But there are many Southern Baptist churches today that are just preaching blatant heresy, and they don't get kicked out of the Southern Baptist Convention. I mean, it's got to be really, really bad. I mean, really, really extreme to get kicked out of the Southern Baptist Convention. Why? Because it's about numbers and it's about money, and there's division among them, and it's a big, top-heavy, power-hungry institution. And I mean, it's certain ones, like I had no idea that Elevation Church, Stephen Furtick, was a Southern Baptist affiliated church. I was like, what? I didn't realize that. He's more of like a charismatic type person. And he's known for preaching false doctrine and the prosperity type gospel motivation. They don't kick him out. I don't know if Rick Warren is officially affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention anymore, but if he is, even if he's not, if it was more recently, I don't know, but he should have been kicked out a long time ago. The Saddleback Church. But yet, no, they keep their affiliation. They're allowed to keep their affiliation. And so, once again, who makes those decisions? They can't even agree at the top. There's power struggles at the top. But yet, here's J. Frank Norris. And at that time, back in the 1920s, just because of certain stands he was taking, and of course he wasn't going to, apparently wasn't interested in shipping his money to them, which is what you do when you're a Southern Baptist church. You give some money to them. And they wanted to ruin him. And he's probably a threat to their power and their influence. In 1923, Norris joined the Baptist Bible Union at its inception. Norris, though, and W.B. Riley, who was instrumental in the Baptist Bible Union, we've already talked about him, they parted ways in 1927 due to Norris renaming his paper the Fundamentalist, which Riley had his own organization and paper of the Fundamentalists. So Riley believed that Norris was stepping on his territory and misrepresenting his paper, because Norris had a paper. And back at that time, so just think about this, there were things that were a bigger deal back at that time. The associations were a big deal. The Sunday school movement, especially in the 60s and 70s. And then the the papers, which Sword of the Lord, we'll talk about Sword of the Lord too. So that was a big deal as well, publishing articles, putting out their own papers. And also in 1925, Norris established the first radio station that was owned and operated by a church. In 1926, Norris shot and killed D.E. Chips in his church office. Norris is really known for this. That's one of his claims to fame, I think, as he actually shot somebody in his church office. He had been threatened twice by Chips. Norris was found not guilty on the jury's first vote, determining that Norris shot Chips in self-defense. The mayor testified under oath that he had sent Chips to the office to kill Norris, and testimony that was presented said that Chips told a number of people on his way to the church that the next morning's newspaper would say that he killed Norris. And 2 guns were also found in the office. Evidently, I think one was probably Norris and the other was Chips maybe. But either way, he was there, apparently pretty clear, for the purpose of killing J. Frank Norris. And so when we say that he had threats made on his life, I mean, these were not empty threats. These were not empty threats. And, the same things still go on today for those that go against the grain of what people think. And I think of those, speaking of self-defense, the verdict on Friday with Kyle Rittenhouse there in Wisconsin. And he was acquitted of the charges. And they determined, that it was self-defense. They couldn't come to any other conclusion. So they said not guilty on all counts. And the attorneys, the judge, they all faced death threats, many death threats, to the extent where the attorney said he stopped answering his phone after the 3rd death threat he got that day, or whatever day it was. And the judge, he and his family were under 24-hour protection because of the death threats he was getting, because of the hysteria, and the lies, a lot of lies. But so when people mean business, and that still goes on today, when you are stepping on toes. And by the way, from what I could see of that judge, he was doing a pretty good job as far as how he handled that particular trial, given the fact that it was so public. And but the so he was going to try to kill Norris, and Norris shot and killed him first. That was the type of person that Norris was. He wasn't going to back down from anybody. He was, all right, you're coming to kill me, I'm going to shoot you first. That was the way he was. And so that's one of the main events in his life that he's very known for, as the fact that he shot and killed someone in his church office. Norris founded the Fundamental Baptist Missionary Fellowship in 1931. Now this is where we get into a few names. Not bad, but a few names here. It was originally called the Independent Premillennial Fundamental Missionary Baptist Fellowship. It consisted of churches that had left the Southern Baptist Convention or were founded as independent churches. The name was changed to the World Baptist Fellowship in 1950. And that's what eventually there was a split off of that later on, Baptist Bible Fellowship International, which we will talk about, the BBFI, because they've been one of the more influential groups in the last 50, 70 years. I'm not sure what their date of inception was, but wouldn't have been 70 years. But hundreds of churches were part of the fellowship. The fellowship sent out foreign missionaries, primarily to China, prior to World War II. John Birch was a missionary who became an American military intelligence officer in China who saved many American lives and was shot and killed by the Chinese communists 10 days after the war when he was just 27 years old. So he was actually John Birch was a Baptist missionary initially. The U.S. government allegedly covered up the details of Birch's death. And the John Birch Society was founded by Robert Welsh in 1958 as an anti-communist, or now they would call themselves, so they're still anti-communist, anti-New World Order, pro-Constitution, and pro-freedom advocacy and educational organization. He gained permission from Birch's parents to name the organization after him, and apparently it's said that Birch's parents became lifetime members of the John Birch Society after it was formed. And so that was not founded by John Birch, but it was founded in his honor, named after him because of his role in against the communists, and he was killed by the communists. And they still are they still provide. I don't know how influential really they are today, but they still. I perused their website. It's been a long time since I was on their website. Okay, I don't remember what all they advocate for, but they are pro-constitution, pro-freedom, and anti-communist and an anti-New World Order, anti-globalist type of organization. They mention God, and I think they mention God, but they're certainly not a Christian organization. It's anybody be able to join them who's like-minded, and they're also known for their I believe their magazine is called the New American Magazine. But anyway, so that's where we're going to stop today, and there's still more to say about J. Frank Norris, and we will continue with that next week. Does anybody have any questions? You know all you want to know about J. Frank Norris today so far, huh? Okay.
Say that his mom had a huge influence on him.
Definitely, absolutely.
Her attitude.
Probably, yes, a lot of grit and fortitude and courage. And we'll see next week. There were some things in his character that, that were a problem. But at the same time, overall, with what he stood for and what he did do a lot of good, and definitely served the Lord, and was. He was not a quick prayer type of preacher either. He was really wanting to plow the ground and make sure there was conviction there. And as I mentioned about him preaching a week about hell in San Antonio before even giving an invitation, because he wanted to plow the ground and make sure that people's hearts were ready. But yes, and I thought, as I was reading about his dad being a drunk, that might be one of the reasons why he was so adamant against the liquor trade. That he personally dealt with that in his younger years, the abuse, he just witnessed that, and certainly that had to have an impact on his stand against the liquor trade. But even if a person's not been personally affected by it, if we just look at what the Bible says, we look at the evils, the fruits of the liquor trade, we can take a stand as well. But he had more of a personal stake in it because of how it personally affected him. All right, that'll be all for today. We'll continue with J. Frank Norris next week, Lord willing.